When Filipinos support, they support big and they support really deep. I think that she's just like the perfect person to be there.
Won 6 cities, 4 continents, 8 months, Birmingham, England in early June, Berlin, Germany just 2 weeks later, Melbourne, Australia back in January, where the queue for Court 6 barely moved because the court had already run out of seats. Toronto this August, Washington, D.C. just a few weeks ago, and on any given Tuesday at Wimbledon, there is a small section of the grounds where at least a few dozen Philippine flags are flying in a country that is not the Philippines. In every one of these cities, with different climates, different currencies, and completely different tennis cultures, the same thing keeps happening around the same 21-year-old left-hander from Quezon City. Her name is Alexandra Eala. She is currently ranked number 20 in the world.
Eala's victory at a career-high top 20 WTA ranking.
She reached a career-high ranking this month, and she has also become the first tennis player from the Philippines ever to win a major professional singles title.
Tennis sensation Alex Eala makes history by becoming the first Filipino to win a WTA Tour Championship.
The story I want to tell you today is not really about her ranking. It is not really about her forehand, her serve, her coach, or even her academy. It is about those cities because if you have watched any of her recent matches, Miami last spring, Eastbourne last summer, or DC just 2 weeks ago, you have probably noticed what everyone else has noticed too. Crowds keep turning up for her in places where they should not even be there, and somehow she seems to have a home court advantage in cities that nobody would ever call home.
But there are so many Filipinos in the crowd tonight, so many flags, thank you!
The story I want to tell you today is not really about her ranking. It is not really about her forehand, her serve, her coach, or her academy. It is about those cities because if you have watched any of her recent matches, Miami last spring, Eastbourne last summer, or DC just 2 weeks ago, you have probably noticed what everyone else has noticed too. Crowds keep turning up for her in places where they should not even be there, and somehow she seems to have a home court advantage in cities that nobody would ever call home. And the question I want us to sit with for the next 20-something minutes is this: where does a home court actually exist? Because the obvious answer, the one you get when you simply skim the headlines, is that Alex Eala has built herself a fan base. She is young, charismatic, an excellent tennis player, and social media has supposedly handled everything else. That explanation is not exactly false. It is simply too shallow. It stops at the surface of something much stranger and completely misses what actually happened in Washington on August 3rd and what continues to happen in nearly every stand where she plays. If you cover tennis professionally, you already understand that most players do not get anything resembling a home court advantage once they leave their own country. You also know that the players who do tend to come from nations with deep professional tennis traditions, Djokovic in Belgrade, Nadal in Barcelona, Serena at the US Open, Alex Eala does not come from that kind of tennis environment. The Philippines had never produced a player who made a serious impact on the professional women's game before her. There is no established domestic tour. There was no major televised pathway. And yet the Los Angeles Times, one of the most respected sports desks in American journalism, published a piece on June 29th of this year, right before Wimbledon, with a description that said, "A Filipino diaspora packs the stands with flags and Tagalog chants, giving her a home court edge." That phrase, home court edge, is not casual fan language. It is not some marketing slogan. It came from one of America's biggest newspapers, using language normally reserved for hometown heroes and applying it to a foreign player competing in cities outside her country. So before we go any further, we have to stop and ask what that phrase actually means. If you are new here, stay with me, because halfway through this story, there is a reveal that changes why that phrase matters, and the reason it fits is not the reason most of the coverage has assumed. And if you find this kind of breakdown useful, hitting the like button genuinely helps me spend more time making pieces like this. So let's get into it. First, you need 5 basic facts about her to understand everything that follows. Alexandra Manalo Eala was born in Quezon City on May 23rd, 2005. She is left-handed, stands 5'9", and plays an aggressive baseline style that can be especially difficult for opponents on faster surfaces. She has trained since the age of 13 at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, not Manila, not the United States, Spain. Her current coach is Joan Bosch, who has worked with her since 2023. And as of the week of August 18th, 2026, she sits at number 20 in the world by a huge margin, the highest ranking ever reached by a Filipino tennis player.
Eala's victory
Those are
at
the
a
5 facts.
career-high top
Keep
20
them in the
WTA
background
ranking.
because none of them alone explains the story. The real story begins when you place those facts beside the crowds. Here is the first thing that does not seem to make sense. Before Alex Eala, the highest ranking ever achieved by a Filipino woman in professional tennis was number 284 in the world. That was Maricruz Jens in 1999, 284. Think about that number. It is not the top 50. It is not the top 100. It is deep inside the qualifying world of Grand Slams, the world of tiny per diems, shared hotel rooms, and matches that almost nobody gets to watch on television. For 26 years, that was the ceiling, which means an entire generation of Filipinos who could theoretically have grown up following a Filipino tennis star never actually had one to follow. There was no domestic pipeline. There was no regular televised hero. There was effectively no reason for someone in the Philippines to grow up loving professional tennis in the same way Brazilians grow up loving football or Indians grow up loving cricket. So here is the question I want you to keep in your head. How does a fan base this loud develop around a sport that this country never really followed? Hold on to that. We will come back to it. The second thing that does not add up happened at the Miami Open in March 2025. Alex had her breakout moment there. She entered as a wild card, ranked outside the top 100, and defeated the world number 2, Iga 6-2, 7-5, to reach the semifinals. By any normal measure, that was the moment that changed her career. And if crowds simply follow success, as conventional tennis wisdom says they do, you would expect Miami to be where the fan explosion began. It was not. According to reporting from the LA Times, the biggest surge of fans in her career came at the Australian Open the following January, half a world away from both Manila and Miami, on a small outside court known as Court 6, where Filipino supporters formed a line that stopped moving because the court had reached its capacity. That is a strange detail, because at that point she had not won a title. She had not broken into the top 30. In pure tennis terms, she was actually less accomplished in Melbourne than she had been during her Miami run. So if winning did not create that crowd, then what did? Keep that question too. It becomes important later. The third thing happened on August 3rd, 2026, when Alex played the final of the Mubadala DC Open against Jessica Pegula. Pegula is American. She entered the tournament as the number 1 seed. The event was being held in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, at a tournament that has been part of the American sporting landscape for decades. Every geographic advantage should have pointed toward Pegula, yet a reporter from The Athletic watching the match observed that Filipino fans made up most of the crowd. Not every person, most of it. An American stadium at an American tournament, filled with people cheering in Tagalog for the visiting player. Eala came back after dropping the opening set to win 4-6, 6-4, 6-0, capturing the first WTA singles title in Philippine history. But once again, the trophy is not the part I keep thinking about. It is the stands. How does a road match stop feeling like a road match? Keep that in mind. And then there is the fourth thing, which is almost too obvious. Alex Eala does not live in Manila. She has not lived there since she was 13. She trains in Mallorca. Her schedule is based largely around the European tennis circuit. In the most literal geographic sense, her home is in the Balearic Islands, not the Philippines. Yet the Los Angeles Times, a newspaper that does not casually throw around phrases like this, specifically used the words home court edge to describe her presence in Birmingham, Berlin, Melbourne, Toronto, Washington, and beyond. So whose home court is it? That is where the entire
Eala's
story
victory at
turns.
a career-high
And this is the
top
point
20
where I want
WTA
you to
ranking.
notice something you may have been assuming without realizing it. If you have watched Alex Eala's matches this year, you have probably made the same assumption I made, and the same assumption most of the coverage makes. You see the crowds and think she built a fan base. You think she became charismatic and successful. The sport attracted a new audience, and now that audience follows her from tournament to tournament. In other words, you imagine that she is exporting Filipino tennis fandom one event at a time, but that is not what is happening. That framing gets the direction of the arrow completely wrong. Alex is not exporting a fan base. She is revealing one that was already there. When the LA Times identifies cities such as Birmingham, Berlin, and Melbourne as places where her supporters appear, those are not simply tournament stops where she arrived, created fans, and moved on. They are cities that already had large Filipino communities, nurses in Birmingham, engineers in Berlin, students in Melbourne, families in Toronto, people who have lived in those places for years, sometimes decades, and in some cases generations. What Eala gave them was a reason to walk into a tennis stadium on a Tuesday afternoon and find one another. The crowd is not a project she created between 2024 and 2026. It is a diaspora that already existed in each of those cities, waiting for a shared moment that would allow it to become visible. And without planning it, without a massive marketing budget, and without some carefully designed strategy, Alex Eala became that moment that is the reframe. You think the crowd is a fan base she built. It is actually a diaspora that was already there. Once you understand that, everything else in this story starts to fall into place. Take a breath here, because the difference between those two explanations might sound minor, but it is not. A fan base that you build is a personal achievement. It reflects directly on the player. It tells you she is popular, but a diaspora that reveals itself around the player is something entirely different. It tells you that the player has become the visible shape of something much older and much bigger than her individual career. It means she is not simply a tennis story. She has become a demographic event, and demographic is exactly the word a former US Open champ used to describe her on the record this June. We will come to that quote in a moment. Proof number one is the geography itself. In that single LA Times article, one story from one reporter, the paper identifies 6 different cities across 4 continents where the same pattern has appeared: Birmingham, Berlin, Melbourne, Toronto, Miami, and the grounds at Wimbledon. And if you read the piece carefully, the important detail is that it does not describe fans traveling behind her from city to city. It describes people who already live in those cities appearing when she arrives. These are local communities, not a touring fan club. That is the footprint of a distributed home crowd rather than a traveling one. And tennis has almost never seen that at this scale. Sania Mirza had a home crowd, but it was mainly in India. Lina had a home crowd, but it was mainly in China. Joao Fonseca has a passionate following in Brazil on the men's side, but Brazil already has a huge professional sports culture and a fan tradition that tennis can tap into. Eala's situation is different. Her home crowd is geographically spread out because of the diaspora, not because of the sport itself. She did not draw the map. The map was already there. Proof number 2 comes from someone inside the sport. Mary Jo Fernandez, a former top 10 player, doubles Grand Slam champion, current ESPN commentator, and someone who has spent 4 decades inside professional tennis, is not exactly known for careless exaggeration. Speaking to the LA Times on the record, she said, and these are her exact words, "It's next level." She brings a whole new demographic.
Eala's victory at a career-high top 20 WTA ranking.
Again. A whole new demographic, not simply a new fan, not merely a larger following, a new demographic. That is language broadcasters and network executives use when they are talking about populations, about groups of people who share an identity and who previously had little or no reason to enter a tennis stadium, but now suddenly do. Fernandez is not merely saying that Eala is popular. She is saying Eala has made a category of people visible inside a sport that had never really counted them before. That is not just a compliment about fan support. It is a demographic observation from someone whose career has been built around understanding the sport and its audience. And it matches exactly what the newspaper saw on the ground. Now, before we get to the third proof, I want to set up what I think is the most revealing scene of Eala's career so far. Picture it while I describe it, because the image itself makes the argument. It is late afternoon on August 3rd, 2026, the William H.G. Fitzgerald Tennis Center in Washington, D.C., which has been home to professional tennis in the American capital since the 1960s. The Mubadalas DC Open final is underway. On one side of the net is Jessica Pegula, an American born in Buffalo, a top 5 player in the world, and the tournament's #1 seed. On the other is a 21-year-old Filipina who began the year outside the top 30. Pegula takes the opening set 6-4. In the normal logic of American sports, this is the point where the home crowd should naturally tighten around the American player. But that is not what happens. Proof number 3. As Alex starts her comeback in the second set, breaking Pegula, holding serve, then breaking again, the sound rising through that Washington stadium in an American city at an American tournament is not the sound of an American crowd rallying around its own player. According to the Athletics reporting from the match, Filipino fans made up most of the crowd. Tagalog chants rise from behind the baseline. Philippine flags fill sections where American supporters would normally be sitting. A visiting foreign player is effectively competing in front of a home crowd inside someone else's home. Eala takes the second set 6-4, then she takes the third 6-0, 6 games without giving one back in a final against a top 5 American player. Her first WTA Tour title and the first one in Philippine history. But again, the score is not what stays with me. It is what those stands looked and sounded like during those final 6 games. Because if you had been told before that day that a 21-year-old Filipino wildcard would be playing before a majority Filipino crowd in a stadium in the capital of the United States, you would have said it made no sense. And under the old definition of a home crowd, it does not. Under the newer definition, it makes perfect sense. A Filipino diaspora already living throughout Northern Virginia, Maryland, and the wider DC metro area simply turned itself into a stadium audience. She did not build that group. She arrived and they came. That is the reframe made visible. That is what home court can mean. When home stops being a physical location, there are still things this explanation does not prove. And I want to be completely honest about that, because a story this compelling only works if we are careful with the facts. This reframe does not prove that Alex Eala becomes unbeatable whenever Filipino fans are behind her. On August 18th at the Cincinnati Open, she led Amanda Anisimova by a set, 6-4, and had opportunities in the third. She eventually lost 4-6, 6-4, 2-6. She dropped 6 of the final 7 games. That is real. That is the difference between being a top 20 player and becoming a top 10 finisher. No amount of crowd noise can erase that gap for you. The reframe also does not mean every tournament crowd will automatically swing in her direction. The Asian swing later this fall, including Wuhan, Beijing, and Tokyo, will offer a serious test of whether this pattern continues in places where the diaspora may be even closer to the Philippines. And honestly, we do not yet know whether the atmosphere will feel identical or whether being closer geographically will change the emotional dynamics of those rooms.
Eala's
The
victory
reframe
at a
also does not
career-high
prove
top
that
20
Alex Eala is
WTA
creating a
ranking.
lasting Filipino tennis culture in the same way that, for example, Lina helped build one in China. That is a question for the next 20 years, and she is barely 1 year into this phase of her career. She could turn out to be a singular phenomenon. She could also be the first of many. Both possibilities are completely reasonable right now. Anyone who tells you they already know which one is true is guessing. And then there is the final piece. In June, Eala said in her own words that she tries not to treat the expectations of her country as a weight she has to carry. Her exact message to the LA Times was simple. Pressure only has the power you give it. That is a remarkably mature thing for a 21-year-old to say, almost like something written by someone twice her age. And I am not entirely sure yet whether she completely believes it or whether she is still convincing herself to believe it. My guess is that it is somewhere between those two things, and honestly, that is what makes it interesting. So let me bring us back to where we started. 6 cities, 4 continents, 8 months. A 21-year-old from Quezon City who trains in Mallorca and now owns a WTA Title I in Washington, standing in stadium after stadium before crowds that at first glance should not be there, but on closer inspection were always there. The reason home court edge is the right phrase, even in cities that are not technically her home, is because home has quietly been redefined throughout her career. It used to mean a place. In her case, it means a people. And those people were already living in those cities. She did not draw the map. The smallest number in this entire story, number one, meaning one Filipino tennis player to ever reach this level, turned out to become the biggest number of all because that one player made a scattered population visible to itself. Mary Jo Fernandez called it a new demographic. That is exactly what it looks like. And not simply a new fan, not simply a new following. A new category of people who now see themselves as part of the sport and for the first time have a reason to walk through those stadium gates. And that is why the final image from DC is so difficult to forget. When Alex lifted that trophy on August 3rd, she was not really a foreigner standing inside a foreign stadium. In the only sense that mattered to the people filling those stands, she was home. She belonged there. Center court, the grandstand, the big stages, the version of home that matters to her supporters was already sitting in those seats before she ever arrived. And now the only question left for her career is what she does with that knowledge. Her next tournament is the US Open, which begins next week in New York, a city with, if you have never spent time in Queens, one of the largest and most concentrated Filipino communities on the American East Coast. Arthur Ashe Stadium holds more than 23,000 people. I would not want to be the player standing on the other side of the net when she walks onto that court for her first match. That is the next chapter, and that is what you should watch. I also want to hear from you in the comments, especially if you have ever been inside a Filipino section at one of her matches, whether that was Melbourne, Miami, DC, or somewhere else. Tell me the city and tell me the exact moment when the people around you realized this was actually happening. Because that moment, multiplied across 6 cities, 4 continents, and 8 months, is the entire story. If the reframe changed the way you see these crowds, tap the like button. Subscribe if you want the US Open follow-up in your feed next week, and I will see you in the next one.